Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to the first in this series of talks for changemakers on why we need to become a larger us and what that might involve in practice. Now, the first thing I always say with these talks is that this is a draft. This is early thinking written in pencil, not pen. We have way more questions than answers. We are still trying to figure all of this stuff out. And that's exactly why we're putting it out there to practitioners, like people doing change making at the front line, to get your feedback, to hear what you think, how we can improve the ideas. So please take all of this as no more than an early draft. So to begin with, in exploring why we need to become a larger us, let's look at this idea that we're living through a long crisis. You've probably seen recent media coverage saying that one of the words of the year for 2022, that's a new addition to the Collins Dictionary, is permacrisis, a word that describes the idea that we're living through multiple crises all happening at once, whether that's the cost of living, the war in Ukraine, growing climate impacts, our kind of increasing political polarization, and so on. And one of the ideas we're really interested in is the idea that this permacrisis isn't just something that's erupted in the last couple of years. It has deeper roots than that. I first co-wrote something about this during the financial crisis in 2009, when I co-wrote this report for the Brookings Institution called Confronting the Long Crisis of Globalization. And that argued that we're living through this age of uncertainty and instability where all kinds of stresses and vulnerabilities in this very, very interdependent system that we've built are kind of bubbling up to the surface. And a metaphor that we used in that report was that navigating this period is a bit like shooting a stretch of rapids on a river. If you think about shooting a stretch of rapids, it's the river, not you, that dictates the speed and the direction of travel. There's no opportunity to kind of hit pause and stop for a rethink or to change strategy. There are real risks when you're shooting the rapids. There's absolutely a possibility that the raft could hit a rock and then get capsized with everyone tumbling into the torrent. But above all, we argued in that report, if you want to shoot a stretch of rapids successfully, it's essential that everyone paddles together. That cooperation is the thing that gets you through this period of turbulence. Now, although when we wrote that report, we were really talking about cooperation between governments and between policymakers, over the years since then, I've come to think much more about the fact that we also need intensified cooperation between all of us, between ordinary people. Because after all, we're the people whose beliefs, whose behaviors, whose values and voting patterns set the political space that politicians have to operate within. So a lot depends on the size of the us that we see ourselves as part of. And one of the things I thought about a lot over the last few years is the way that there are so many actors who have both motive and opportunity to get us to think of ourselves as a them and us, rather than an inclusive larger us. I mean, think of tech giants like Facebook and how the content algorithms that determine what we see on those platforms really lean into the things that we find scary or outraging, because it's a very effective way of monetizing our attention. The news media is often at it too. Think of how often you see TV shows where they've deliberately set the show up with guests with wildly opposing views who are going to have a huge argument, again, because it's an effective way of keeping us watching and selling more advertising. Populist politicians know this playbook back to front, of course. Look at people like Donald Trump or Vladimir Putin and how they expertly foment a sense of kind of grievance and anger in order to get us to see ourselves as part of a larger, part of a them and us. Or look at conspiracy theorists like the kind of QAnon crowd and how they as well feed on those kind of them and us dynamics. Now, all of this makes me wonder, who are the people doing the opposite, bringing us together rather than dividing us? And one of the questions that we'll be exploring over the next few weeks that's right at the heart of everything we do at Larger Us is the question of whether we as changemakers may actually be contributing in some ways to these them and us dynamics. This is something I sort of first started thinking about when I was leading Avaaz's Brexit campaign a few years back. Avaaz, if you don't know it, is a big global online citizens movement. And as a campaign director there, I ran lots of different campaigns, but in particular, Ranavars's Remain-leaning Brexit campaign. My job was to try and secure a second referendum on whether Britain should leave the EU. And if we'd managed to do that, which of course we didn't, to fight like hell to make sure that this time around voters chose not to leave the EU. The thing was that the more time I spent working on the issue, the more it came to seem like a kind of a septic wound in our politics, not just a normal political disagreement. And I was uncomfortably aware of the ways in which my work was certainly not doing anything to help heal that divide, and might even in some ways be contributing to it. And the thing is, there are good reasons for changemakers to use that them and us playbook. If you look back at Saul Alinsky, the legendary US community organizer who wrote the book Rules for Radicals, in that book he sets out 13 rules for changemakers, the last of which is this one: pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. And what Alinsky understood very well is that when you create a them and us, or when your campaigns are focused on a really resonant enemy, it's terrific for firing up your political base. It's also great for getting lots of media coverage. It may also be very effective at securing fundraising income. But the question we're going to be exploring over the next few weeks is, well, what are the costs of that them and us playbook? And also, what are the alternatives? And in particular, we're going to be looking at how can we, as changemakers, through our work, create a larger us rather than a them and us. Now, let me say at the outset what we mean by a larger us. When we talk about that, we're really thinking about three things. The first is the job of what Albert Einstein once referred to as widening our circles of compassion. And this is really about the size of the us that we identify with, that we see ourselves as part of. When we think of us, are we just thinking of our friends and family, or maybe even just an atomized I? Or are we thinking wider than that? Are we thinking about an us that includes everybody in our community, maybe everyone in our country, maybe even all humans or other species too? A lot depends at this point on how big is the us that we identify with. Because if, for example, we walk down the street, see a homeless person and cast them in our minds as part of a them, rather than as part of the us that we care about and worry about, then that affects our political decisions. And again, the political space that we're giving our policymakers, whether we're showing demand for them to do something about the plight of that homeless person. Similarly, when we see the floods in Pakistan a few weeks back, are we seeing those people as part of an us within our circle of care, or are we casting them in our minds as a them? And again, that has really tangible political impacts. So that's the first part of becoming a larger us. The second thing we mean by becoming a larger us is expanding the political coalitions that we're trying to build as change makers. If you're from the UK, you've probably seen this graphic. It shows a breakdown of the British electorate into a range of different segments, political tribes, if you like. This was produced by More in Common a couple of years back. And what we often see with change making is that we're very, very focused on firing up our base, as I mentioned earlier. So if we're progressive activists, for example, we focus on firing up other progressive activists because they're the people we see most. They're the people in our networks. But another idea that we're going to be exploring over the next few weeks is that in order to secure victories that last, we need broader coalitions that bring in other segments, and that means we're going to need to use some slightly different tactics to build bridges across some of those political divides. Third and finally, and most challengingly, we think that the idea of a larger us is also bound up with the idea of, well, what if there is ultimately no them? What if in this hyper-connected, interdependent age where we're all kind of bound together in this web of relationship and interdependence, it's ultimately impossible to draw rigid lines between an us and a them? And this is something that I think was beautifully captured back in the 60s by James Baldwin, a civil rights activist and also a gay rights campaigner, who wrote a famous letter to his newborn nephew. And one of the things he set out in that letter, talking about white supremacists, was the idea that these men are your brothers, your lost younger brothers. And he went on to say, if the word integration means anything, this is what it means, that we, with love, shall force our brothers to see themselves as they are, to cease fleeing from reality and begin to change it. Now, it's worth digging in a bit more to why we need a larger us? Because, I mean, some of those arguments I've just set out may leave you kind of reacting against them a bit and thinking, well, surely some people are beyond the pale, and why shouldn't we focus on firing up our base? Isn't that how we really drive change? And I think there's really two ideas that we think are central to why we need a larger us. One that I've already touched on is the idea that we need victories that last. If we end up in a highly polarized system, like this graphic here shows the United States, it's actually a graphic of connections on social media, and it shows how red and blue, Democrat and Republican, are broken into these kind of self-referential echo chambers with minimal read across, so that you've got these two sides that are really talking past each other, and then that's of course reflected in politics. Now the problem is that that means it's impossible really for either side to win lasting breakthroughs. There's lots of kind of conflict, but no real transformation. And a great example of how that is so is climate change, the issue that I've worked on most over the last 20 years. I remember back in 1997, Bill Clinton's administration signing the Kyoto Protocol, the first big UN treaty that was setting out actual emissions targets on climate change. But then fast forward to 2001, and of course, George Bush took his Republican administration out of the Kyoto Protocol. Barack Obama then joined the Paris Agreement when he was president in 2015. But of course, President Trump took the US straight out again once he got elected. President Biden has now taken the US back into that agreement, but who would say that's the end of the story? You get the picture that rather than sustained support over decades for this enormous transition the US economy needs to make, instead we get this flip-flopping back and forth with no lasting change. And that really is because of polarization. And the thing is that climate is one of a whole range of issues where we really can't afford for that to be the case. Look at the big interdependence issues of our times. Things like safe migration, things like international development, things like COVID-19. These are all issues where it's absolutely fundamental that we pull together and cooperate across electorates as well as across governments. But actually, these are four issues where we've seen culture war dynamics erupting on all of them. And if we, as change makers, are contributing to those culture wars, that makes our job harder. It makes it more difficult for us to secure lasting change. So that's one reason why we need to become a larger us. The other reason is about protecting democracy. Now, on some issues, you find that the polling data shows that actually publics aren't as polarized as they often think they are, that they may have more agreement on issues, on the substance of the policy, than you would believe from just watching the news and so forth. But even in those cases, what there's a lot of is what political scientists call affective polarization. And this is the kind of polarization that's not about disagreement on the issues, it's just about dislike or fear or mistrust of the other side and its values. And this creates a threat to democracy. This is something that's really well captured by the Australian political psychologist Karen Stenner, who wrote that liberal democracy has now exceeded many people's capacity to tolerate it. And what she's really getting at here is that in her research, she finds that there's a quite significant group of voters, about a third of people, she reckons, who have a very, very strong preference for oneness and sameness, particularly where values are concerned. It's really important to them to have a sense of a shared moral order. And when these people feel like they don't have that, when we have instead this kind of cacophony of culture wars, as we see around us at the moment, it's enormously stressful for those people. And they can tip in these conditions into a sudden, very pronounced preference for authoritarian government. Now, of course, that's exactly what we've seen happening in the United States in recent years, most notably with the twilight days of the Trump administration and the attacks on the US Capitol. But it's still bubbling away now, even though the recent midterm results were much more positive for kind of centrist and moderates than they had hoped before the election. It's nevertheless the case that a huge number of American voters still voted for kind of election-denying, hardline, authoritarian platforms. And so America's still very much on a knife edge. But it's not just America. I mean, in case you're watching this in the UK and thinking, well, that's America, but things are nowhere near as bad as in the UK, look at some of the polling data. One recent opinion poll carried out by the think tank Onward asked for voters' support for a, quote, strong leader who doesn't have to bother with parliament or elections. And they found 46% of voters agreed with that statement. But perhaps especially worrying, in case you think that those kind of authoritarian views tend to be among older voters, in fact, this poll found that those views are most pronounced among younger voters. And if they lose faith in democracy, that's our political future right there. So that's another reason why we as change makers maybe need to think hard about whether we're constructing a them and us or a larger us. So that's a quick snapshot of why we need to become a larger us, perhaps, and what that means, and some of the issues that we think are at stake. And I'll be back after the break with a bit more about how we can become a larger us.